Okay, so now I have the pleasure to introduce Ivo Tiebosch. We invited Ivo to present here today because in the context of the contract program that is being producing modules for the ETPLAS website, Ivo is the responsible of the Competence Assessor module. That's the new module that will be called Module 27 that Nuno already mentioned. And that's why we thought that this presentation would fit here, because even though he's a member of one of the working groups, two working groups of this project, he's here with an AHA hat. And it's really important for us to see how these competence assessors will have the opportunity of having specific training. And let's hear what Ivo is bringing you today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to explain and demonstrate what the module 27 about competence assessment and competence assessors about. Rafael just explained a lot about the tools that can be used by a competence assessor, but of course, to use them accurately, you need to be trained. And module 27 is a guidance on how to train these people. But before I go into the people that we want to train, I would like to shortly elucidate where I come from and what made me decide to wanting to do this assignment. I was a lecturer in biology for a few years, and then I became a lecturer on anatomy and physiology at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, training basic training to veterinarians. Before I became a PhD where I studied stroke, and for that I had to make induce stroke in animal models. And I used a model called thromboembolic stroke models. And it took me a year and 120 rats to teach this to myself, because only one PhD took one effort to one actual demonstration to me how a surgery like that would go. And the other was history, 120 rats. I needed to teach myself this. And I think this is a horrific part of history where people train themselves in these complex procedures. And during my PhD, I started to train animal technologists to do the same procedure. And then it took only 3 weeks and 12 rats. They didn't make all the mistakes causing animal suffering. I did a good job, apparently, because they asked me to become a member of staff at the Faculty of the University of Applied Sciences, the Faculty of Zoology, and I trained animal technologists for a while. And I started to actively move within the assessment strategy and in the transition of normal education towards competence-based education, where we more focus on competency and competency performance in the actual work field instead of just teaching knowledge and skills to people and then let them develop in the field after they have graduated. So this transition of competence-based education instead of knowledge and skills-based education was of big interest. I restructured the examination structure of the institute, and I was asked to teach others to do the same. And after that, I was asked to join the animal welfare body. And that for me was a great opportunity to enhance the quality of science, which is one of my passions. But the other one is to assure that people were no longer trained in the method I was trained, to eradicate this autodidactical methodology and to have people supervised and assessed before they are able to and allowed to operate independently. Because that's also what's on the directive. There it states that if you carry out one of the following functions, you are supervised in your task until you have demonstrated the requisite competence. Yeah, and there is someone like me responsible to ensure that the staff are adequately educated, competent, and continuously trained, and that they are supervised until they have demonstrated the requisite competence. That means that this will ensure that there are situations like this, where someone is performing a procedure and someone is assessing. And in this case, she's filling in the dots, maybe, and she acknowledges that there are some skilled moves, but does that mean that someone is competent? So saying that someone's skilled is easy, or saying someone that's not so skilled might be easy, but saying that someone is not competent or not competent enough and needs to be supervised, that's a different story. That's a hard story to tell. But just a recent example demonstrated again that it is important to assess competence and not as much skill. Because someone could actually perform a procedure. This is a subcutaneous injection in a mouse. This mouse is well restrained. The PPE is well acknowledged, so that he uses gloves. He actually watched into the needle before injecting, so this is all fine, right? But it's not so fine if I tell you that this person is injecting a local anesthetic into the flank of an animal before doing surgery on the head. Yeah, and if you know enough of behavioral sciences, if you do a local anesthetic in the side, you're not supposed to do surgery on the head. So still, I would not trust this person, to do this procedure on their own without proper supervision. I don't think this person is ready. So this means, the law means, and I think the directive has good guidance, and this is implemented in also, at least in the Dutch regulations, that a person until has demonstrated competence is a trainee. And someone supervising this trainee until a competence assessor comes in and assesses someone as competent. Which means that the supervisor could train the procedure and monitor the development. And the competence assessor can then assess competence in the procedure, which is a complicated thing. So supervised until, that's what we're stating. And in the original education and training framework, there was already a system on how competence is growing while being supervised. And it is quite a complex system, and I even added a level. So it's a level of supervision going down. It's quite unique in competence-based education literature, but it has some advantages. So it states levels of supervision, and I've added level 5. Pointer, there we go. I've added level 5, which is learning the basic skill on non-animal material and observing only, because I think that you should at least have some practical skills before you even start using animals. And then you have the hands-on supervision, where some supervisor is actually sitting with you and doing the procedure and taking you along with every step, and then ask you to do every step and supervises you closely to say, okay, you do this, that, do that, and now it's this to do, what do you have to pay attention on? So it's a closed process we call hands-on supervision, until the supervisors decided, okay, you know all the steps, but you have to do it a certain amount of time to be actually competent, to engage and to have certain situations in which you have to interact with complications, for example. And after this hands-on period, where there are different levels of retracting the supervision, at a certain stage, the supervisor would say, you're ready now. I think you are at a stage where you can actually perform this procedure without me being present. And that's where the competence assessor comes in. And then you achieve level 0, means that the supervision is reduced to nothing, and you can do this independently in another institute or in the institute itself. Okay, this demonstration of competence is the highest level of the pyramid. Miller, I don't have to explain it because you've seen it already plenty of times. It is an interesting model of building up knowledge and skills until a level that you actually apply it in practice. And that is what you can use actually tools like DOPS, as that has been explained, that you do it into practice. But this also means that there is a shift in responsibility. I presume you have read an article published by Raphael on the 8 steps towards competency. And he states that training under supervision should allow for learned skill set to be applied in the local environment. And that the assessment as step 4 of competence should be done in a normal working environment. That means that you take education as a primary source of basic skills and knowledge for the lower levels of the pyramid, but the higher levels of the pyramid are often assessed within the institutional situation and no longer under the wings of education. And that means that supervisors then have educational responsibility of competence-based development. And that is something that is that you're starting to ask from people in the field to do and reflect upon people that are their colleagues or sometimes even the scientist of project that they are involved in as animal technicians. And such a supervisor then should know the procedure. That's what was just explained. Perform the activity, guide the trainee, and assess for learning, as was explained by Raphael. You can use DOPS also for assessment for learning, and they can have a variable background. They could be scientists, animal technicians, veterinarians, or even caretakers. And the question there is, can the supervisor prepare for the assessment accurately? And can the supervisor assess for learning in the process of becoming more and more unsupervised and more independent? And that would mean that you have a competency framework for the competences for the supervisor itself, which also applies for the competence assessor, who should be then independently also know the type of pursuit and has to decide whether someone is really competent and allowed to do this alone, and assessment of learning. So this is the final certification kind of assessment. And again, this person could have a variable background. Some people would say that has to be a veterinarian, but that's not directed or regulated, and it could be even a caretaker when it comes, for example, for welfare evaluation. Then it could be a caretaker who is more proficient in understanding the procedure. But then again, these people need to be trained, because a competence assessor should create a proper image of the competence of the trainee in a very short period of time. And that's something you need to learn, because that's not easy, especially if you want to take all aspects into account of proper trust. And again, so the competency framework here below could be a suggested framework for what these people would need to know and need to learn. Because acknowledging competence, like I said, is not easy. Again, we have the same situation here. There is a technician who is going to do a procedure on a pig, and then the competence assessor is first wondering whether or not he knows the anatomy of the pig and cuts at the right spot. He has to know how to handle the tissue, so that's a very neat skill. Be quick, but not too quick. How to delicately handle the tissue. Does he know how to monitor the animal's anesthesia while doing the procedure? And of course, in pigs, there are always often more people than one, but it could be. What the effects are of what he does on the data, because these animals are used in science and ought to generate valuable data. Does he show compassion to the animal? Because when you ask people what is important of competent people working with animals, that they should show compassion. And the big, major $1 million question is, could I leave? Could I leave and then trust this person with this procedure, knowing that if anything goes wrong, he will do the right thing? Well, the person being assessed has to take care of all of this and demonstrate all of this, and then is also wondering, why isn't he looking, overthinking all the things he has to assess? So a lot is going on in this assessment procedure. And as a competence assessor, you are the one who ought to manage this. So learning how to do this, how to establish competence, but also manage the whole process of competence assessment. It is good that the European Committee decided that this is something that people should be able to learn. So they asked LAS Learning, which is a cooperation of several universities and an ICT company known as LAS Learning, to develop Module 27, which are learning outcomes for a competence assessor. And this module 27 is available. So not on the learning outcomes will hopefully be in the education and training framework, but the module to explain these learning outcomes and aid in learning them are in module 27 on the ETPLAS website, and they are already there for testing and reviewing. And the idea is that they can be done standalone, but preferably they are done in a blended learning environment, because competence assessment is something that you cannot learn on paper alone. Yeah, so unless you have a very didactical background and already have done a lot of assessment, you could use the online module. That's how I use it. But if you're blank when it comes to education, you should do it in a blended learning environment. Here are the learning outcomes. Okay, I'm not going into them into details because there are quite a few. And some of you have already taken them because I shared them yesterday. And of course, they will be publicly available later on. And you can also see them in the module or following the module. These learning outcomes follow a cycle. As you saw yesterday, that good education follows a PDCA cycle. So that means that the learning outcomes follow a PDCA cycle, because even when you're doing assessment and even when you want to do valid assessment, that does still mean that you want to improve yourself continuously. First, you have to identify the goal of an assessment, the need for it, the why, as Rafael already explained it, and then to establish what you want to actually measure and why the competence assessment is important. And then you have to select and construct assessment tools. So preferably you're just going to download DOPS from the ETPLAS website, but there are more skills and procedures in laboratory animal science than we have DOPS available. So you might have to develop and construct assessment tools yourself. And then you have to perform the assessment on a proper way and report and communicate the results to the candidate immediately for learning or for certification purposes. And then you have to evaluate and improve the assessment procedure as it has been done to improve yourself. Teaching always means improving yourself. So first you have to identify. So I'm going to just give some samples of what we're trying to get across for all these phases into the PDCA cycle. And by identifying the goal of an assessment, it's also important to identify what to assess. And this is part of a publication I have sent and is currently under review with laboratory animals about the identify and trustable professional activity, and to state what the activity could be that you assess, because you have to point the procedures of, you have to make a list of what has to be assessed. And the competence assessors should establish that list together. We've tried this now at Utrecht University. In UMC University, we have about 560 EPAs. Yeah, that have been identified. It looks like an immense job to assess all of them, but from the other perspective, most people only learn during their PhD or their scientific career 5 to 6. So you don't, from an institutional perspective, it's a major load, but from a personal perspective, it's not that bad. So an example could be a skill here. So one of the examples I often use is the corneal occlusion of a heart, where you grab the animal or get the animal from the stables, you prepare the surgery table, you take the animal, you do a whole surgical procedure under anesthesia, monitoring the animal, suturing the animal, and guarding its recovery. And then you can sign it off as being a complete coronary occlusion. And there are some procedures that could be translatable to, of course, other procedures like the anesthesia, the monitoring of the anesthesia, of the suturing. So you can imagine that if you have this trustable professional activities, that if you're competent in some of them, that you can, after a while, transfer parts of these to other procedures, making it easier to learn new professional activities. Then you have to acknowledge competence, and then you have to figure out what are elements of trust. And that actually requires a competency framework of what is competent activity within laboratory animal science. And we have made a suggestion, and it is based on, again, medical literature. What are elements that allow you to trust someone to do a procedure where there is a risk for a person in this case, or patient, or an animal. And the left circle is the circle where you actually measure, and that's knowledge, skills, and attitude, as you also have known from the Miller pyramid. And knowledge and skills are part of doing, but also modesty, reliability, and integrity, which are elements that allow you to trust someone. This is, of course, also influenced, competence is influenced by other factors like personal traits, experience, values and beliefs, and culture. But these are parts that are not being measured and not necessarily being part of being competent, but they could influence the visual attitude. Yeah, and might make it harder for these to develop. Acknowledging competence also means that you gather proof. And Rafael already pointed out, preferably you have several observations at the workplace. And even said it should be 6, but that might not be feasible. So a way to circumvent this is, first of all, you have to do a direct observation of the procedural skills, fill in the DOPS form, and you could do that several times, but if not, then you could use the value of a training and a track record, because during the supervised development, people are being constantly monitored and assessed by the supervisor. By anyone who's been able to review this. You can add an interview with the candidate to establish whether or not the person has really understood what he's doing, and to assess deeper learning. And you could even have supervisor input to have a gathered, solid decision. We call this also programmatic assessment, and it's also a major development in humane medicine, where you actually try to find as many data points for proper decision making. And this enhances the validity of your assessment, because one observation might not be valid enough to have the right and correct decision. Another model that we have developed, I'm going to teach the competence assessment, is STEP. It is something that has been thought through by Laura and Kuipers, which was one of my students. And it is a methodology of creating an atmosphere in which the person who is actually being assessed can perform optimally. And what you have to do is first to think of a structure of how this assessment is going to take place. So what are the steps within an assessment? Getting to know the person, making him at ease, doing the actual assessment, writing down the notes, restructuring your thoughts, and then, of course, conveying the result. And you're being transparent about it in the beginning, so that you know what's coming. Especially people who are being assessed are insecure, and there might be consequences of the final result of such an assessment. So it's good to be transparent. It's good that you are aware of how you act and communicate whilst doing an assessment, like I did show in the example. If you're not paying attention while the person is performing, he might get insecure and think, okay, I've already failed. So that's important. And the last one is participation. That was a really interesting perspective, but you can actually make people a director of their own assessment, because they are going to demonstrate that they're competent, and you are not, you're just, acknowledging this. And that perspective makes people far more at ease. So that's one of the models that we have developed and will teach in the model. And then we come to the evaluation, and you've heard some of the quality aspects of a proper assessment. First of all is the validity. Are we assessing the proper things to assure the full area of what is competent, but also to enhance the objectivity and reliability, which can, for instance, be stimulated by using DOPS. The conditions, which is the step model, and the purpose. Are we assessing for learning? Are we assessing of learning? And the whole registry of assessment can also give information about the quality of training at the institute. So there are several purposes assessments can have. And it's very good to know the different purposes and not to mess them up, because in the Dutch educational system, a lot of young children are really being damaged by people not understanding purpose of assessments. So it is important to know what the purposes are and how to use that. So finally, I want to explain briefly how we can address this module in a blended learning setting. So what we are developing now at the Utrecht University of Applied Science, my former employer, is we are testing a competence assessor training where we have a blended learning session. So the syllabus mainly is the EEU module 27, and that gives us time to spend time in the training on making this practice. So we take a procedure that people want to train. We ask them to write a proper SOP on that or a proper protocol, and then transfer that into a DOPS sheet, and then to see the process of restructuring such a DOPS sheet, because it's not easy to make a DOPS sheet out of a blank decision. We know that right now, Raphael, that it's not easy just to write down a DOPS sheet. There is a process of pre-testing, administration, and item reduction. We let people train on how they interact and videotape their own interaction with others to learn how they actually perform within an assessment procedure. And we teach them how to reflect on their own performance. And then people slightly become more educated in the education of competence assessment. And again, we gather all kinds of proof, as with programmatic assessment, and we combine that into a certificate saying you are a trained competence assessor. So that's what we have achieved. What could still be needed? Well, maybe a trainer. So how do you train people to become a competence assessor? How to use the module 27? I would gladly provide such a workshop, and we are working on that, and we will talk about that also on Falasa. We would be interested in thinking further a competency framework for being in practice. So I have been involved in developing DOPS, and then you ask people, okay, what is competent behavior? I've shown you what we have now in the module, which is derived from the clinical situation, but you have things like being empathic to the animal, ensuring that the data quality is reliable. So there are all kinds of aspects in competence assessment that delineate competencies that make up competence. So that's something different from, of course, the competency framework that is already in place, because this is mainly focused on basic training and not as much on competence assessment. So this is a preparation. So this is the preparatory education. And there, of course, we have a framework, but it's mainly directed on the lower level of, again, this beautiful Miller pyramid, but not as much on the higher. We could work on that. And finally, I'd like people to review the quality of assessment checklist. So we made a checklist where you can check all the aspects of qualitative assessment. This checklist is newly developed, and with all parts, we can learn and become better, as Susanna already pointed out. So if you have feedback, if the checklist doesn't work for you, we'd like to hear why and what could be improved. And we will present also this at Falasa. I've shared some of these checklists yesterday, so people have them. And some of them have them in their bags right now. So have a look at them, test them, and then let us know if there are improvements. And to round off, I think that acknowledging competence is not an easy job bestowed on people that will actually need to learn this, but I think you can learn how to do it. Thank you.
One question. There's room for one question.